The plan had been in place for 3 weeks before I ever set foot on that porch. I want you to understand that going in, because everything I'm about to tell you, every conversation, every stumble, every moment where I seemed confused or lost was deliberate. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. I do not lose my keys. I do not forget names. And I did not drive 9 hours from Phoenix to Portland to be anyone's victim. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Walter. My daughter's name is Rebecca. And the man she married 6 years ago, the man I am about to tell you about, his name is Marcus. I'll let you form your own opinion about him by the end. Rebecca was 31 when she met Marcus at a company retreat in Sedona. She called me that same weekend, excited in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager, describing her first car. She said he was charming, successful, that he made her feel seen. I was happy for her. I genuinely was. I had raised Rebecca alone after her mother passed breast cancer 11 years ago, and watching my daughter light up like that was something I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. I met Marcus 3 months later over dinner at a restaurant he chose in downtown Phoenix. He shook my hand too firmly, the way men do when they're performing confidence rather than feeling it. He talked about his investment portfolio before the appetizers arrived. He referred to my daughter twice as Beck, even after she gently corrected him and said she preferred Rebecca. I noticed those things. I filed them away. I said nothing, because Rebecca was happy, and sometimes love asks the people who care most to stay quiet. They married 14 months after that dinner. I walked my daughter down the aisle and did not cry until I was alone in the hotel elevator afterward. I gave them a check for $20,000 as a wedding gift. Marcus framed it before cashing it. Rebecca told me that over the phone, laughing, as though it were endearing. I remember thinking it was strange. You don't frame a check you intend to keep. You frame it when you want someone to see it. The first 2 years were fine, or appeared to be. Rebecca called every Sunday. We talked about her job at the nonprofit, about the garden she was starting in their backyard, about whether she wanted children and when. Marcus was rarely in the background during those calls. When he was polite in the way that costs nothing, quick hello, back to whatever he was doing. I told myself that was just his personality. Some people aren't phone people. Then the Sunday calls started getting shorter. Not dramatically, not all at once, but where we used to talk for an hour, we were down to 30 minutes, then 20. Then, some Sundays, she didn't answer and would text me later. Sorry, Dad, crazy week. Call you soon, and soon never quite arrived. By the time 8 months had passed like that, I had started to feel the particular loneliness of a parent who can sense a door closing, but cannot find the handle. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself she was busy, that she had her own life, that this was healthy and normal. I had friends whose children had drifted and come back. I kept my concerns to myself and did what I always do when something bothers me. I started paying attention. I noticed that when I did speak to Rebecca, she never mentioned visiting, not a hint of it. We had spent every Thanksgiving together since her mother died, just the two of us, a tradition we both treated as sacred. That November, she called 2 days before the holiday and told me Marcus's family was coming into town and she was sorry. She should have told me sooner. They'd make it up to me at Christmas. I cooked for one that Thanksgiving and watched football in a quiet house and tried not to think too hard about what was changing. Christmas came. Rebecca called on the 23rd to say they were going to Cabo. That was when I called my lawyer. His name is Gerald Thorne, and I have known him for 22 years. He handled my wife's estate. He helped me set up the trust that holds the house in Phoenix and the rental property I own in Flagstaff, together worth just over $600,000. I told Gerald that I had a bad feeling I couldn't shake, and that I wanted to understand exactly where I stood if someone tried to challenge my mental competency. Gerald was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Walter, has something specific happened?" I told him no, not yet. He said, "All right, let's make sure we're ready." Over the next several weeks, Gerald and I quietly moved several things around. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would raise flags. Just the kind of careful preparation that a structural engineer understands instinctively. You don't reinforce a bridge after it starts to crack. You do it before. I also hired a woman named Patricia, who runs a small private investigation firm in Portland. I want to be clear that I did not do this lightly. I did it because I love my daughter, and because something in her voice during those short phone calls had started to sound like a woman choosing her words carefully. Patricia spent 2 weeks observing. She sent me a report on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and I read it twice, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold. Marcus had met with a real estate attorney 4 times in the preceding 6 weeks. He had also visited a memory care facility called Harborview Gardens in the Portland suburb of Lake Oswego, not as a prospective resident, but asking questions about the admission process for a family member who was showing early signs of cognitive decline. He had done this without Rebecca present. Patricia had the dates, the times, the name of the intake coordinator he had spoken with. My daughter had no idea. I sat with that information for 3 days. I thought about calling Rebecca directly, showing her what I had found. I played that conversation out in my head a dozen times, and every version ended the same way, Marcus getting ahead of it, spinning it, telling her I was overreacting, that he was just being responsible, planning ahead. And Rebecca, who had been slowly, steadily, redirected away from me for the better part of 2 years, choosing to believe her husband over her father. I needed something she couldn't argue with. I needed him to do it in front of witnesses. So I called Rebecca on a Friday evening and told her I'd been having some trouble. Forgot where I put my phone twice that week. Got confused driving home from the grocery store, ended up on the wrong street. Nothing serious, I told her. Probably just stress. But it had shaken me a little. I kept my voice light. I said I didn't want to worry her. She was very quiet on the other end of the line, and then she said, "Dad, maybe you should come visit. Marcus and I have been talking about we want to make sure you're okay." I said that sounded like a good idea. I hung up and sat in my kitchen for a long moment. The house was quiet. Outside the window, the Phoenix evening was turning that particular shade of amber that my wife used to love. I thought about her, briefly. I thought about what she would say if she could see what was happening to the family she had trusted me to hold together. Then I called Gerald and told him it was time to move to the next step. I drove to Portland on a Wednesday, which gave me the drive time to settle into the character I intended to play. I want to be precise about this. I was not acting confused to be cruel, or to play games. I was acting confused because the only way to expose what Marcus was planning was to let him believe it was already working. You cannot catch a man in a trap he doesn't think is there. I arrived at their house in the Hawthorne neighborhood at 3:30. It's a nice street, old craftsman homes with deep porches and mature trees. Rebecca and Marcus had bought the house 2 years into their marriage, with, I later learned from Gerald's investigation, a down payment partially funded by refinancing Marcus's previous condo, and partially by a personal loan that still carried a balance. The house was in both their names. My name was nowhere on it. That detail matters. I parked in front of the house and sat for a moment. A man across the street was raking leaves in his front yard, a tall man, maybe 55, wearing a red flannel shirt. He looked up when I pulled in and watched me get out of the car with the kind of open, uncomplicated attention that neighbors in quiet streets have. I was pulling my overnight bag from the trunk when I heard him call out, "Hey, you here to see Marcus and Rebecca?" I looked up. He had stopped raking and was standing at the edge of his yard, arms resting on the rake handle. Something in his expression was careful, like a man deciding how much to say. "I'm Rebecca's father," I said. "Walter." He nodded slowly. He glanced toward Rebecca's house, then back at me. He walked to the edge of the sidewalk and lowered his voice in the way people do when they don't want to be overheard from a distance. "My name's Dennis," he said. "I've lived across from them for 4 years. He paused. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm not a man who gets into other people's business. But you're her father." I set my bag down. "What is it, Dennis?" He told me that 3 weeks ago he had been working late in his garage with the door open. Marcus had come home around 9, which was unusual. Marcus typically traveled for work Monday through Thursday and was home by 6 on Fridays. Dennis had gone to wheel his recycling bin to the curb and had overheard Marcus on his phone in the driveway, unaware anyone was nearby. He had heard Marcus say, clearly, that the old man was starting to slip and that it would be easier than they thought, and that once he was placed, the property consolidation was straightforward. Dennis looked me in the eye when he finished. I don't know exactly what he's planning, he said, but I know what I heard. And I know your daughter doesn't know he made that call, because she was out of town that week. I thanked Dennis. I shook his hand. I picked up my bag, and I walked up the porch steps of my daughter's house, and I rang the doorbell, and I waited. Rebecca answered, looking tired in the way that isn't about sleep. There were small lines around her eyes that hadn't been there at Christmas 2 years ago, when we had still spent Christmas together. She hugged me tightly, and I held on a beat longer than usual, and when she pulled back, her eyes were slightly wet. "I'm really glad you came, Dad," she said, and I believe she meant it completely. Marcus came in from the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel, smiling with his teeth. "Walter, great to see you. How was the drive?" "Long," I said. I looked around the living room as though taking it in for the first time, even though I had been here twice before and remembered exactly where everything was. You've done some things since I was here last." "We repainted the living room," Rebecca said. Right. I touched the doorframe absently. "Your mother would have loved this color." Rebecca's expression softened. Marcus's didn't change. We had dinner at the kitchen table. Rebecca had made chicken piccata, which she knows is my favorite, and I played my part carefully. Not dramatically. I didn't drool or stare blankly. I was simply a man who seemed slightly slower than usual. I repeated a question I'd already asked. I called Marcus Michael once, and then corrected myself and said I was sorry. Long drive. I noticed Marcus watching me across the table with an attention that was not concern. After dinner, Rebecca cleared the plates, and Marcus leaned back in his chair and said, in a tone designed to sound casual, that there was something they wanted to discuss with me, something they'd been thinking about for a while. Rebecca came back in and sat down, and the expression on her face was one I recognized, careful, rehearsed, the face of someone who has been coached on how to have a conversation. Marcus began talking. He talked about getting older, about how it was natural for things to change, about how he and Rebecca just wanted to make sure I was supported. He said the word support 4 times in 3 minutes, which is the word people use when they mean something else. He talked about how managing a home alone could become difficult, about how the market in Phoenix was strong right now if I were ever thinking about selling. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that he had done some research into residential communities that offered graduated levels of care. Nice places, he said. Really quite nice. Not like the old days, more like resorts. I listened to all of this with my hands folded in my lap and my expression open and a little uncertain. Then I said, "You know, I've actually been thinking about this too. I'm not sure I'm handling things as well as I used to." Rebecca reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "Dad?" "No, it's okay," I said. Maybe you're right. Maybe I should think about getting things in order." Marcus smiled. Not a big smile, a controlled one. The smile of a man watching something fall into place. What happened over the next 4 days is the part that required the most patience I have ever exercised in my life. Marcus moved carefully, which told me he had done his research. He didn't overplay it. He suggested we visit Harborview Gardens just to look, and I said that seemed sensible. He printed materials from 2 other facilities and left them on the kitchen table where I would find them. He had a casual conversation with me about my finances, in which he said he just wanted to understand the full picture in case he needed to help manage things, and I answered his questions vaguely and let him believe he was assembling the picture he wanted. Rebecca was present for most of this, and I could see her getting quieter as the days passed. On the 3rd morning, I came downstairs early and found her sitting alone at the kitchen table with her coffee, not reading, not on her phone, just sitting. I sat across from her and said, "You seem like you have something on your mind." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Dad, are you actually okay? I mean, really?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." Because some of the things this week," she stopped. "Marcus thinks we should start the paperwork for a healthcare proxy, so that if something does happen, he can make decisions quickly. He says it's better to do it proactively." Before she stopped again, I kept my voice gentle. "Before what?" She shook her head. "Before it becomes complicated." I reached across and covered her hand the same way she had covered mine 4 nights before. "Let's do whatever makes sense," I said. "I trust you." She looked away. I could see her working through something, and I wanted to tell her everything right then. Wanted to put it all on the table and let her see clearly who she was living with. But the documentation wasn't complete yet, and there is a particular kind of person who, when confronted without proof, will gaslight their partner so effectively that the confrontation itself becomes the problem. I had read Marcus correctly from the first firm handshake. He was exactly that kind of person. I needed 2 more days. On the 4th evening, Marcus came to me in the guest room and said he'd been in touch with a financial consultant, a friend of his, very discreet, who could help me restructure my assets into something more manageable. He set a folder on the desk beside me. Inside was paperwork for a financial power of attorney that would grant Marcus authority to manage my accounts, investment properties, and real estate holdings. I looked at the documents for a long time. I turned a page slowly. I looked up at him with the expression of a man slightly overwhelmed by paperwork. "This is a lot," I said. "Is this normal?" "Completely standard," Marcus said. "Gerald, your lawyer, he's getting older too, right? Sometimes it's easier to have someone closer to the situation handle things. Someone who can be there in person. Gerald Thorne is 58 years old and recently ran a half marathon." "I suppose that makes sense," I said. Marcus set a pen on top of the folder. I said, "Let me sleep on it." He said, "Of course," and left the room. I waited until the house was quiet. Then I took a photo of every page in that folder and texted them to Gerald with one line. "Is this what we expected?" He replied 20 minutes later. "Worse, actually. This is the extended version. He's going for everything. Call me in the morning." I set my phone face down on the nightstand and lay in the dark in my daughter's guest room and listened to the house breathe around me. I thought about Rebecca at 7 years old, the summer we took her to Yellowstone, how she had stood at the edge of the geyser field in her yellow raincoat and refused to back up, no matter how many times I told her to, because she wanted to see it better. I thought about her at 17, sitting on the floor of our living room surrounded by college brochures, asking me which one I thought she should choose, and me telling her that was entirely up to her. I thought about her face at her wedding, the genuine happiness in it, the way she had squeezed my hand before we walked down the aisle. She had been a woman in love. She was now a woman living inside something that had gradually replaced that love with something that looked similar but wasn't. I made a decision in the dark that night that I had been building toward for 3 weeks. The decision was not about the money. It was never about the money. The decision was about what my daughter deserved to see clearly. In the morning, I came downstairs and told Marcus I was ready to sign. He could not quite hide his satisfaction. He suggested we do it that day, at a notary he already had arranged, which told me he had been one step ahead of the conversation, which told me how long he had been planning this. Rebecca was going to come, he said, as a witness. I said that was fine. What Marcus did not know was that the night before, while the house was quiet, I had made one other call besides Gerald. I had called Dennis. We sat at a conference table at a notary office on Morrison Street at 2 in the afternoon. Marcus, Rebecca, the notary, and me. Marcus had the folder. He slid it across to me with the same practiced ease he'd used in the guest room, the ease of a man who believes the outcome is already decided. I opened the folder. I looked at the first page. Then I closed it. "Marcus," I said, "I'd like to understand something before I sign." He smiled patiently. "Of course, Walter. What's your question?" "I'd like to understand why you visited Harborview Gardens 3 weeks before I arrived, before I had told Rebecca or you anything about memory concerns." The smile didn't fall. It thinned. Rebecca turned to look at her husband. "I was doing preliminary research," Marcus said. "Being proactive, I thought. You told an intake coordinator there that your family member was showing early signs of cognitive decline." I kept my voice completely even. I was not showing any signs at the time. I had not mentioned any concerns. "You were at that facility before I told Rebecca anything." The room was very quiet. "Walter, I think I also want to understand," I continued, "why you made a phone call in your driveway on the evening of February 14th, a Thursday. You were back early from a work trip in which you told someone that the property consolidation would be straightforward once I was placed." Rebecca stood up. She didn't say anything. She stood up and looked at her husband, and in her face I watched something she had been carrying for months clarify all at once, the way a photograph develops in a dark room slowly, then completely. Marcus began to explain. He was good at it, I'll give him that. He had a version ready. He was trying to protect Rebecca. He was frightened for my safety. Everything was out of love and concern. He reached for her hand across the table. She stepped back. Rebecca, I said, I need you to know that I have been completely well this entire week. There is nothing wrong with my memory. Everything I did in your house this week, the confusion, the mistakes, was deliberate. I needed to see what would happen if the opportunity presented itself. She stared at me, her eyes filled. Dad, I know, I said. I'm sorry for the deception. I need you to understand it was the only way. I opened my jacket pocket and placed a small folder on the table. Inside was Patricia's report dates, times, locations, a transcript summary of the driveway, phone call, recorded legally under Oregon's single-party consent law because Dennis had turned on his phone before approaching Marcus's driveway that night. I had asked him to, during the call the night before. Inside was also a statement from Gerald Thorne outlining what the document Marcus had put in front of me would have legally permitted full authority over both properties, all financial accounts, the retirement trust, and the authority to make residential placement decisions on my behalf at his sole discretion. Gerald's statement described it, in his precise legal language, as an extraordinary and improper overreach of standard proxy documentation. Marcus stood up. He said this was absurd, that I had manipulated the situation, that the recording was legal, I said. Gerald confirmed it. He looked at the notary, who looked carefully at the table. Marcus looked at his wife. Rebecca was holding the edge of the conference table with both hands, reading Patricia's report. She was not crying now. Her face had gone very still. Marcus, she said, I want you to leave. He said her name. Please leave this room, she said, right now. He left. Rebecca and I sat at that table for a long time after. The notary quietly excused herself and closed the door behind her. The fluorescent light above us hummed in the silence. On the street outside the window, Portland went about its afternoon people walking. A bus pulling away, a woman on a bicycle holding a paper coffee cup. My daughter was crying without making any sound, which is the way she has always cried since she was a little girl. I moved to the chair beside her and put my arm around her shoulders and held her the way I had when she was small. She leaned against me the way she used to. For a while, neither of us said anything. I knew something was wrong, she finally said. I could feel it. I kept telling myself I was imagining things. I know. He said you were getting older and I needed to think practically. He said it so many times that I started to believe. I started to wonder if I was being a good daughter by not. She stopped. Dad, I'm so sorry. You have nothing to be sorry for, I said. He is very good at what he does. That is not a reflection of you. She pulled back and looked at me. How long did you know? I had suspicions for a while. I had evidence for about 6 weeks. She closed her eyes. 6 weeks. I needed to be certain before I said anything to you. And I needed you to see it yourself, not just hear it from me. She understood that. I could see her, understand it, the recognition that if I had come to her with Patricia's report alone, without the demonstration in that conference room, there would have been room for doubt. Not because she wanted to doubt me, but because Marcus would have created the room. What do I do now? She asked. That is entirely up to you, I said. That has always been entirely up to you. We drove back to her house separately. Marcus's car was gone when we arrived. She called a friend, a woman named Claire, who I had met at the wedding, and Claire came over within 30 minutes, and I was glad for that. Rebecca needed someone who wasn't me beside her for what came next. I went to the guest room and called Gerald. It went as planned, I told him. The folder didn't get signed? No, it did not. Good man, Gerald said. I've already begun the paperwork on our end. The trust amendment is ready to file. The Flagstaff property transfer is queued. When you get back, we'll finalize everything. Thank you, Gerald. Walter, he said, before I could hang up. How is Rebecca? I thought about her face at that conference table, the stillness in it, the grief and clarity arriving at the same time. "She's going to be okay," I said. "She's stronger than she was given room to be." I left the next morning before 8, before Rebecca was awake. I left a note on the kitchen table that said, "Call me when you're ready. I will always pick up. Dad." I drove the first 2 hours in silence, the Portland suburbs giving way to the Cascade foothills, the foothills opening into the broad quiet of the high desert. I thought about Marcus not with anger, or not only with anger, mostly with a kind of resigned clarity, the way you feel when a structure you suspected was unsound finally proves it. He had looked at my daughter and seen access. He had looked at me and seen an obstacle to be removed and then an asset to be managed. That says everything about him and nothing about us. I thought about Dennis, raking leaves across the street, who could easily have said nothing, who had no obligation to a stranger in a driveway. I thought about what it costs people to speak up when they see something wrong, and how much depends on whether anyone does. 3 weeks later, Rebecca filed for divorce. She called me the evening she served the papers, and her voice had in it something I had not heard in a long time, something clear and a little tired and completely her own. She said she had been in contact with a therapist, that she was doing okay, that some days were harder than others. She said she was sorry it took this long for her to see. I told her the same thing I told her at that conference table she had nothing to apologize for. She laughed a little, which was the best sound I had heard in months. She asked if she could come to Phoenix for Thanksgiving. I said that I would start planning the menu. The house in Phoenix is still mine. The Flagstaff property is still mine. Gerald filed the trust amendments the week after I returned home, adding additional protections that would require a full court hearing and 2 independent medical evaluations before any competency challenge could proceed. We documented everything: the report, the recording, the original power of attorney document Marcus had prepared, Gerald's analysis of it. All of it preserved, all of it accessible if it ever became necessary. I walk through my house in the evenings now, and I see it differently than I did before this happened. The family photographs in the hallway, the chair by the window where my wife used to read, the coffee table where Rebecca and I played cards on winter nights during the years it was just the 2 of us. These things belong to me, which means they belong to the life my wife and I built and to the daughter we raised. They were never going to be anyone else's inventory. I am 64 years old. I am in good health. My memory is, as it turns out, excellent. Some people look at a man my age and see someone whose edges are softening, whose grip is loosening, who can be slowly redirected without quite realizing it. They see a long game that seems easy to play because the other person doesn't realize there's a game at all. What they miss, what Marcus missed, completely, is that the men and women who built things, who raised children alone, who buried spouses and got up the next morning and made breakfast and drove to work and kept going, those people have been playing the long game since before some people were born. We know patience in a way that youth hasn't learned yet. We know what it is to wait for the right moment. We know that the most important structures are the ones you build before you need them. The trap was set. It just wasn't the one he thought.